Today, we're going to dive into how tech roles are changing, where the biggest skills gaps are, and what it means for the future of IT work. Seth Robinson from CompTIA and Beth Pariseau from TechTarget join me to share insights from the latest research and real world reporting. We're covering everything from AI to infrastructure and seeing where the conversation takes us. Welcome to the Business of Tech Lounge, the live version of the Business of Tech podcast. It's Wednesday, April 30th, 2025, and I'm Dave Sobel. I'll take questions and comments throughout the show, so make sure to put them in chat. If you have a question, we'll happily respond to it. Now, I want to thank Sales Builder, our Patreon sponsor, whose support makes this show possible. Focus on your IT sales workflow with the power of automation and visit them at salesbuilder.com. That's BUILDR.com. A reminder, I am watching the chat. Throw those questions in there. Now, Beth Pariseau is a senior news writer at TechTarget, specializing in IT with a keen focus on AI integration, software supply chain security, and observability. Her reporting sheds light on the practical implications of technological innovations in enterprise environments. Beth, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Analyzing technology, workforce trends, skills demands, and the evolving role of IT professionals. His work provides strategic insights into how businesses adapt to technological advancements and workforce challenges. Seth, welcome back to the live show.
Hey, Dave. Thanks for having me back.
Now, I am super excited to have you two mix it up because you come with both research and real world reporting expertise that I think we can merge here into something really interesting. And Seth, I want to I start you off because CompTIA has identified 6 core job families: support, infrastructure, software development, data, cybersecurity, and tech enablement. So, which of these are experiencing kind of the highest demand currently, and where are the ones you're foreseeing evolving with the rise of AI and automation?
I think we see high demand across all of them. I think the highest demand continues to be in software development. We're definitely seeing numbers dip a little bit, which I think could be a wide variety of reasons. The economy, we've talked before about companies beginning to pull back on some of their tech investments and just get a little bit more cautious and want to make sure that they're getting good return on that investment. So I think that applies to hiring as well. But we still see a lot of demand out there. And I think that companies are still not where they want to be with their overall technology acumen. So I think they're going to continue hiring. And as for which jobs are going to be affected by AI, I would say all of them. But I want to caveat that a little bit because I think that the jobs are going to evolve, like I said, rather than we have all of these new jobs being created. Just this week we saw in the Wall Street Journal, they kind of positioned it like this job of prompt engineer has become obsolete, which kind of presumes that prompt engineer was ever a thing to begin with. I'm not sure that it ever was. I think a lot of people thought that it would be, in the same way that they thought blockchain engineers would be a thing. But I don't know that that really came to pass. What we have seen over and over is technology changes a lot of these job roles that are existing. And sometimes you get something new that branches out, but more often than not, we see evolution there. So we can dive into that to your heart's content.
Well, it's funny because I will admit I was one of the people that was almost thinking that prompt engineer was going to be a thing, reported on the show and thought there'd be advancement of it. And it seems that maybe folding in as an actual just skill that employees are going to need to be trained on. But Beth, you've done some recent coverage here because you've been highlighting the integration of AI agents into development environments.
Mhm.
And if I kind of couple that with some of the messaging, Shopify CEO recently talked about the fact that now they're looking for, you have to justify that you need a human and you've already exhausted AI to it. You're doing reporting on these integrations of the AI agents. What are business leaders telling you about this, the way that this is shifting their thought on developers and the kinds of hiring that they're going to be doing?
Well, there's what's happening now, and there's what people think will happen in the future. And obviously,
Fair.
the latter is changing very rapidly, almost as rapidly as the technology itself. It has only been about 3 years since generative AI burst onto the scene, and now AI agents are, it's only been really the last 6 months. even this time last year, nobody was really talking about AI agents or agentic AI. As far as prompt engineer, I don't think it's a separate role, but prompt engineering is definitely becoming a really important skill for developers. Um, I think so far generative AI has found its most widespread use among software developers as a coding assistant. And AI agents are the subject of a ton of hype so far this year, with actual real world at scale usage, few and far between from what I've seen. There's confusion about what AI agents are as opposed to generative AI, what AI agents are good for and not good for, and the cost of large language models, generative AI, and the AI agents that's built on top of that remains a real problem. The return on investment is a big question mark for enterprises, but um, there's no question that generative AI and AI agents have changed software development the most profoundly. I'm still having conversations with people now that AI agents and vibe coding has become a buzzword, about whether or not software developers will have jobs in 10 years. And there are still people who say no. But I think so far, generally, this AI hype train hasn't quite lived up to all of its lofty promises yet. And there's still a lot of kinks being worked out, especially with AI agents. So,
So I think it's worth pausing here for a second, because this is kind of the intersection of the tech with the skills gap, and I think that is worth spending a little bit more time here. In particular, Seth, I think I'm going to ask you here. Like, one of the things that Beth is bringing, that kind of real world insight, and the element of, hey, there's been a lot of hype, but we're only 3 years in, and by the way, there's still a lot of question of ROI. When you're looking at workforce development, are there particular trends that I can talk about, both from the perspective of, like, say, company investment versus personal investment in time? Are you starting to see the elements of the way businesses are being effective with it? Are there signs in the research? Give me a little bit of a sense of where that overlap between the tech and the skill is really coming together.
Sure. Yeah. If we back all the way up to kind of a big picture of what's been happening in the skill development space, I think we've seen companies and organizations that want to close their skill gap. And in some cases, they might not know exactly what those skill gaps are. They might know that we want to do better in cybersecurity, or we need to do better in analyzing data. That's been a huge one for the past few years. But they don't know the specifics behind that. And they don't always know the prerequisites to that either. So if we take data analysis, they might not recognize that they're not doing so great at data management that would allow them to do the analysis. And so it really does take, I think, a thorough understanding, and then the ability to assess where your skill gaps actually are. And I think that one way that companies and organizations have tried to kind of shortcut that is they're typically looking for relatively experienced people, right? And that there's only so many of those, and so we get the supply and demand thing. And meanwhile, there are a lot of people coming out of either traditional educational pipelines, or maybe they've done self-study and they're ready to get started. And the problem is that they don't have quite the depth or breadth of skill that a company would need. But a lot of companies haven't built up that muscle of starting to do internal training and upskilling and reskilling, and taking the workforce that they have and beginning to move it to the workforce that they need it to be. And so I think that at a real high level, again, that's what we're seeing is organizations start to realize that they're not just going to continue finding unicorns out there. They need to get really good at understanding what skills they need. They need to do their absolute best at hiring and trying to find those people. But they also need to get good at internal training and improving skills, whether that's evolving job roles that already exist, or sometimes retraining people from one job role that might be diminishing into another job role that's expanding.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't call out Bruce Wayne, who's watching us, who say it's all about more neural networks. And if I'm not, and I distinctly have to reference, if the Batman's weighing in, then I clearly have to weigh in. But Beth, you'd be talking specifically with companies that have like actually done implementations here. Are there specific examples? Let's even talk like just sort of generative AI and the integration into the IDE. Are there particular examples of companies that are doing a really great job here, or ones that you've reported on that have been doing less of a good job on that integration?
Excuse me. 5 years into the pandemic and, still
You're
not
well
figuring out
trained
how
to
to
mute yourself, and we appreciate the politeness there.
So, one example that stands out from this year of someone who's actually using AI agents in production in the real world is a CISO from a company called Arion, which publishes satellite flight data for airlines and airports, and they are using a relatively new large language model from White Rabbit Neo. It's actually an open source model, which kind of was ahead of its time. It was before DeepSeek, and an integration platform, to create their own AI agents, and they're using that as reinforcements for security operations and security operations center personnel, because the adversary already has access to this tech, and it in the short term, I've been hearing that adversaries will benefit more from AI agents and the scale that they can provide than defenders. And so this company, Arion, is trying to even the score. They're using a company called Kindo that puts AI agent building into their day-to-day app development process. So, but that is one that I can say I've talked to extensively, that I did a case study about in January, that seems to be living that dream. Also, in terms of things like GitHub Copilot, there's one of my best sources is Kyler Middleton,
Yeah.
who is doing a lot of work with GitHub Copilot Enterprise at her company. And it does seem like coding assistants are a solid, established, good use case. That coding assistants, almost a more advanced form of autocorrect, really has found its way into most developers' workflows at this point. But I also heard some people say at SRECon that they see diminishing returns from some of the generative AI services they access through an API, because a change to a model behind that API surface can have unexpected effects on the quality of the output. And if you're using a service from a company rather than your own in-house AI, then you may not know that the model has been updated. So there's definitely still plenty of growing pains, and I'm digging to find real world production usage of AI agents, and that has been kind of hard to come by so far.
Well, I think you're seeing that there's a lot of hype to that and not necessarily full implementation. I think directionally we may be talking about it, but I think it's still pretty early. Now I'm going to
Yeah,
throw
if I
up
could
this.
jump in, if I could jump in,
Yeah.
like the two things that jump out to me when I hear about Beth talking about the use cases are, on the one hand, if you have an organization or maybe a department of software developers, let's say, that is pretty savvy at what they're doing and they can use AI agents to speed up what they're doing, then the question becomes, okay, well, do we need fewer software developers then? And that question kind of presumes that the organization is going to be content at the same level of software development that it has been. But if they can speed it up and increase it, why wouldn't they invest the same amount and get more output? I think that question plays into what will happen to the humans in the loop here. And then I think to the other side of the equation, where we're talking about the hype not exactly matching, I think this goes back to so many other technology trends that we've watched, and especially automation. Automation has been a strong desire of a lot of companies, the way that they want to use their technology function, but it's very, very complicated. And simply setting loose an AI on something and say, hey, automate and integrate all of these applications that I'm using in my workflow, that maybe not going to go any better than it was when humans were trying to do it, especially if AI is making mistakes along the way, and humans aren't trained to watch out for those mistakes. And so I think a lot of the lessons that we've learned from past technology adoption are applying to AI now. And, we talked about that we're 3 years in, which on the one hand is maybe a short amount of time. And on the other hand is maybe plenty of time to start really understanding what the ROI or the true value of this is going to be.
I don't think anybody's arrived at a solid understanding yet, though. There have been surveys in the last 3 or 4 months that talk about enterprises struggling to clarify the ROI, pushing ahead with efforts anyway, but having a hard time, especially because these things are so expensive to run. And there is development on small language models, specialized language models that are better suited to specific fields like cybersecurity. Cisco actually just came out with a cybersecurity LLM that an internal team that it built, specially trained for cybersecurity. An observability vendor, Dynatrace, I talked to him on my podcast. Alois Reitbauer, the Dynatrace head of product, and he was talking about working with the large language models so that they can better understand the result of a given section of code, and change it so that it gets a different result, but that specific automation using generative AI and AI agents isn't yet quite ready for prime time in terms of automating incident response. So, there is work happening, and as with every new technology, the costs are coming down over time, but that's all very recent. Cisco open sourced that LLM this week. And I was talking with Alois from Dynatrace about this as a future prospect. So, and yeah, there's definitely still a lot to come from the field of neural networks, and there are many artificial intelligence types beyond language models. So,
Well, and one of the ones that I just was recently tracking is there's lots of legacy code porting. There's a new one in terms of COBOL
Mhm.
expertise to help for taking old code and moving it up into like Java, for example, is another use case. One of the trends that I think that I want to take is we almost take a step back from the AI agent and the full automation to some of the data processing. I've had a number of guests on my shows recently talking about how they can work on solving the reporting agent. In fact, I'll throw to our good buddy Batman there, who's actually referenced the fact that wanted to understand some of the areas where data processing and data relevancy around this might be important. What are the data that's worth extracting from here? And what I'm finding is that it solves something of the reporting problem. I'd like to get your feedback on this. The premise being that, oftentimes a lot of software has a bit of a report problem. Either you create a large pile of pre-canned reports that are limiting to an organization, or you give them a massive report builder that nobody knows how to do anything with. But what generative AI is allowing people to do is actually make queries of their existing data and get some usefulness back. But you're nodding. I'm going to say, do you have particular examples there that are relevant or stuff around data processing?
Yeah, a few observability tools have introduced automated report generation, so that you can show your tech performance data to your pointy-haired boss and help him understand, whether it's good or bad, what the value is to the business. There are definitely applications in enterprise search that companies from startups, specialists to like Glean to Atlassian have been applying in their products. So anytime you have a knowledge base or a developer needs to write documentation, and developers, no secret, hate writing documentation, these things can be really handy. They are absolutely great at generating text. And yeah, I think that's one area. There's also the notebook phenomenon in observability where, these kind of composite views into data can be created on the fly. So that is an area where I think AI has found a solid niche.
So, Seth, I'm curious here because I feel like there's lessons implied what you said earlier about we've looked at emerging technologies before and we've seen this pattern. And every example that we've come up with and we've talked about here have real world examples. We're still measuring the ROI, but interestingly, they're what I would classify as kind of boring, right? Like they're not super sexy, we've taken over the world kind of things, but they're like actual areas where the technology is making an impact. Is there some kind of trend that you can talk to or larger lessons from the patterns of emerging technology that we should be looking at here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few common threads when it comes to the technology workforce and the way that organizations use that technology workforce, right? And so one would be, to your point, Dave, some of these sound kind of boring. And to go back to maybe, software development, I think we like to imagine that someone will be able to sit down at a prompt and say, write me a program that does this. And they can just write it in, natural English and it comes out. And an AI tool can probably do that, but does the person who wrote that then have the skill to know if that program is correct or not? Can they go through the QA? Can they do the testing? Do they have the practice to know whether that's good or not? So I think one thing that we see is this division between are we really enabling people at lower levels of skill in, say, software development or data analysis? Are we allowing them to do that? Or are we really just accelerating people that already have that skill? And I think a lot of the cases that we're talking about are accelerating skill that already exists. And I think that if you extend that forward, it becomes a little dicey to think that we might be able to take a human completely out of the loop, or that we would get to that place where a less skilled individual can completely replicate the job of a skilled individual by using AI, because you need some of that skill and knowledge and acumen in order to produce that ultimate result. I think another thing that we see is kind of the moving target. And I mentioned this before with kind of the quantity of output, whether it's software development or network bandwidth or whatever it is. That target's always moving. I think the target for how technology gets used is always moving too, right? And so one example of where this probably plays out is with help desk. And there's always this thought that, like, oh well, if the general workforce gets more skilled with technology, then we won't need a help desk anymore. And you still need a help desk. They're just not solving the same problems they were before. Those problems can be solved by workers on their own. But that first line of defense, the bar just keeps raising. And so we see this in the job posting numbers, and we see this kind of in the employment numbers, that IT support is not going away. It's just that the nature of that job is changing. And in a lot of ways, the amount of skill that you then need to do that job is changing and growing. And so it's not becoming a less skilled position, it's becoming a more skilled position. And I think it is maybe to be determined, but I would say it's a little unlikely to think that AI is just going to abstract away all of these complications in what has become a very complex situation with IT architecture and the way that companies are using technology with a host of applications. I think that that target is always going to be moving, and so it's going to be very difficult to get AI to just chase that target constantly and do the job for us.
Now, interestingly, your comments there, and particularly as you bring back up human in the loop, makes me think of, so 2 weeks ago, Juliet Powell and Brad Gross were on the show. Now, Juliet's an ethics and frameworks expert, and Brad Gross, of course, is a lawyer who focuses on MSPs. And one of the key message both of them were reinforcing from both angles was accountability, right? And the idea of linking AI to the accountability. And Beth, I have to ask, because you recently did some coverage around identity and access management here, and then immediately makes me go like, okay, I need to know more a little bit about how the conversation is happening around identity and access management as it relates to either AI agents or AI more broadly. And I know you've done some reporting here.
Yeah. I think it's still actually a little bit forward looking with identity
Okay.
and access management. There are some companies that are making strides there. And right now, everyone and their brother is rushing to add identity and access management features to Model Context Protocol, which is all the rage in terms of
Mhm.
a standard or proposed standard for how AI agents use tools and interact with one another. There are also some open standard protocols being developed for agents to communicate across orchestration frameworks themselves. There's Agent to Agent, which is a Google-led project. There is Agency, which is an Intel and LangChain-led project, and this sort of so there's a difference between AI agents right now, which are the kind of individual semi-autonomous workloads that carry out tasks, and agentic AI, which is going to require an entirely new internet. If you listen to Intel talk about the work they're doing with agency, there's going to have to be a recreation of service discovery, network management, security for large networks of AI agents, and that's really what is meant by agentic AI. But the two terms get conflated. But yeah, and AI governance is definitely something that big vendors from ServiceNow and UiPath and Atlassian are talking about. Observability players like CoreLogix acquired a company, Aporia, that is all about monitoring AI usage and securing communications and monitoring for poor quality results and hallucinations. So um, everybody is really working furiously on this, and it's definitely a big concern because some of the early pioneers of Gen AI, famously an airline in Canada had to abide by a crazy price that its chatbot gave a customer. So nobody wants to end up in that situation, and I think enterprises are looking very carefully at how to secure AI. Um, but to the point about AI doing boring stuff, that's exactly what it should do in a lot of people's eyes. It should automate the boring, busy work that you don't want to do. And Google Dora had a very interesting report recently about developer adoption of AI, and it's kind of like, well, the secret here is a lot of developers like to code. So what they want to automate is the boring stuff, not necessarily all the coding. And Kyler and I actually have talked about this vibe coding phenomenon and whether or not there's the skills in house to secure and evaluate and ensure the quality of the output of Gen AI tools. And, her point, which I think is also an unanswered question in the industry, is, if a junior developer is exposed less to hard coding, how do they get to be the senior developer upon whom there is increasing pressure to review this massive wave of AI generated code? How do you get from that junior level employee to the senior level employee in the future if people are exposed less to the inner workings of code and are doing more vibe coding or even AI agent assisted coding? How do you develop that expertise in whether or not the code that's generated is maintainable? And I think that's an open question.
Well, and we're flirting really close to the philosophical questions too. Like the one I like to reference is I want automation to do my laundry, not to make my art. Like
Exactly.
and if I think about life, and if we get into the human side of this, like I don't want to take away the joy portion of it. And in a way, like when you talk about like developers that want to develop, like there is a joy in creation that is a human experience that we don't want to de-emphasize. Seth, I'm almost inclined to say, like, CompTIA spends a lot of time thinking about certification and career paths. Like, is this a question that's coming up in terms of CompTIA and its certification to think about this arc of career and the impact on it?
Yeah, I think we are spending more time thinking about the arc of somebody's career. I think if you go back, a few decades, then there were these discrete, distinct jobs within technology, and you could train to become this thing, or you could train to become this thing. And there's still some of that, certainly, but I think that so many things now stack on top of each other. I mentioned IT support before, and that typically was seen as a traditional pathway into IT infrastructure. We see companies now that, because their IT support needs to have that wide breadth of knowledge, you can go from IT support into infrastructure or into software development or cybersecurity or data. You can go into any of those pathways, and any of these pathways that we are examining have AI as a component. rather than us, thinking about a distinct AI pathway. Now, maybe in the future, those will come up. It wasn't all that long ago that we probably wouldn't have talked about a data pathway as standing on its own, but now we do. And so I think that we are very interested in that question that Beth brought up about how do you become junior and then get to be senior. And this goes back to the very first thing that I was saying about, companies need to invest in that capability, whether they're investing in it through actual training or if they're simply identifying a taxonomy of skills that an individual needs to acquire in order to get a promotion or move to a next level or maybe move into a completely separate field. I think that focusing on the skills that are needed across a wide range of job roles, and with AI being one of those skills, or one of those skills in many different pathways, that's the way that I think we're going to continue building this workforce rather than taking a strict job role by job role approach.
All right, now we're gonna have a little bit of fun with our last couple of moments here because I'm dying to get a little bit of a reaction from both of you on this vibe coding. Like, so it's come up now in terms of the conversation. I'm going to ask sort of a quick sort of take for each of you. How real is vibe coding as a long-term thing? How comfortable are organizations going to be with rolling out production code that people vibed on? Like, is it a real thing? Beth, I'll throw to you. You mentioned it first. And your good hygiene with your muting.
I figure somebody would fire up the industrial weed whacker outside my window right now. Vibe coding, it is a thing. There are, tools like Cursor that are gaining popularity, that I know of some real people that I've met in person that, are actually using them as advertised. But the consensus I have so far is that, vibe coding can be great for citizen developers like product managers to develop an idea. They can be great for prototyping, but you would be crazy to put them into production at an enterprise.
Right.
You really need to test those things very thoroughly to actually have something workable. That it's good to do an MVP, but a production level product, definitely not yet, if ever.
Seth, do you want to weigh in on vibe coding?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I think that kind of highlights the two parts of the answer, right? Which is, in one, so vibe coding we think of as this distinct thing, and we think of like, okay, how are you going to train in vibe coding or something like that? And if you're trying to apply that to software development, I think that 5 years from now, software development might look different, but we're still just going to call it software development. This is what it looks like now. And it uses these techniques and these tools to produce an output. And then, of course, the output is the other part of that question, which I think with a lot of this AI stuff, even to your point, Dave, about, you don't want AI to produce your art. Well, if you're in the minority, then AI will be producing art. It's kind of like, what is the market going to bear and accept? And I do think that we're in this interesting kind of point in time of trying to figure out what is the value of human generated content or human generated code or whatever, and how can you validate that? You see these tools coming on the market to detect where AI content is being generated, and will the market value that or not? I think some of that remains to be seen, and I think it will largely just sort of expand and create new facets in the market, and overall we'll see where that lands us, but I continue to be optimistic about continuing to need a lot of technical skill, because these fields are just going to evolve rather than shrink or die or change into something completely new, and then the market is going to continue on technology driving a lot of this stuff, as it has been for the past few years now.
I have to laugh. Bruce has almost got it right again, in that you've got to have planning in it. Early in my career, what we're now calling vibe coding, we called prototyping and hacking up a product, and I think we're just using tools to do it. I know we could go all day. I want to be respectful of both the listeners' time and both of yours, but I know you're both working on cool stuff. If listeners are interested in getting in touch and learning more, what's the best way to do that? Beth, how can people get in touch?
So my email address is beth.pariseau at informatechtarget.com. And then I'm also on LinkedIn under my name. And those are two of the best ways.
And Seth, how can people get in touch with you?
Well, CompTIA is always publishing new research, so you can always find some of our latest research at CompTIA.org. And if you've got questions on that or anything that I said today, or you want to disagree with me, then you can write me at srobinson@CompTIA.org.
Well, Beth, Seth, this has been great fun. Thank you both for joining me. I'm looking forward to having you back on future panels.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Now, I want to let my listeners know that I recently spoke with Dan Candy. He's the CEO of Cork, and we talked about the intersection of cybersecurity and financial protection through their unique cyber warranty model. Now, he explained how Cork empowered MSPs by validating compliance across client endpoints and mitigating financial risk, the idea to enhance security and trust. I want to give you a preview of that interview. Now, what I also would be curious to know is like, it feels like there's the combination of cybersecurity plus financial warranties might lead to more complacency among clients. Like, is that something that you're tracking or able to watch for and have data for, or is there a reaction that you're able to track? Like, how are you combating the risk of complacency?
I love the question, and it's actually the opposite.
Okay.
And the reason it's the opposite is because we're able to illuminate where there's risk in all of the businesses. And because the risk is never static. The thing about cyber insurance is that it's, a relatively aged business, right? It's, what is it? The second oldest profession in the world, I believe is what they say. And so
this isn't a show for the first, so.
And so the model is relatively traditional, meaning it's a, 12-month policy, right? But we all know as business owners that things change daily, right? You have a new employee or you let go an employee, which means that there is a new computer, right? There's a new endpoint, and you've got to address the endpoint protection. And so that happens how many times a day or a week or a month? And that means that all of these security protocols are changing so rapidly, and the risk profiles are. So I say that because the compliance framework is the same, but the attack surface is changing. And so that's why we are always working with our partners to illuminate what that looks like. What we have found using Cork data, but again, reflect on Q4 of last year and Q1 of this year, is that when we onboard a new Cork partner and their clients, we are able to get them to 77% compliant within the first 7 days.
I'll tell you, I'm very intrigued by the idea of the link of finance. What I also would be curious to know is like, it feels like there's the combination of cybersecurity plus financial warranties might lead to more complacency among clients. Like, is that something that you're tracking or able to watch for and have data for? Already have this interview now. If you want to get access early, that's a benefit of supporting the show. Visit patreon.com/MSP Radio to sign up and get access now. The interview will drop on the YouTube channel and podcast feed this weekend. Now, I want to thank Sales Builder, our Patreon sponsor, whose support makes this show possible. Focus on your IT sales workflow with the power of automation and visit them at salesbuilder.com. That's BUILDR.com. And vendors, you too can get your name mentioned on the live show. It's a simple monthly subscription. Visit patreon.com/MSP Radio to learn more. And listeners, you can support the show. The number one thing you can do to help us out is like, share, and follow on your favorite platforms. This makes a huge difference. Tell your colleagues, share it around, and make sure you've told them you heard it here on the Business of Tech. Or support directly on Patreon with our Give What You Want model. You set what you think the content is worth, and you get access to the videos and interviews early. If you have a question and are listening to the recording, send it in at question@mspradio.com. Thanks for joining me for the Business of Tech Lounge, and I will see you next time.